If there's any two fighters in the UFC that won't ever give each other any semblance of peace, it has to be Nate Diaz from America and Conor McGregor from Ireland. Starting all the way back from their first pay-per-view fight in 2016, the two MMA stars have what is probably the biggest rivalry in the history of MMA. The two might slap it off soon too. Let's talk about it a little. Starting off with McGregor challenges Diaz in Dana White's Power Slap League. The first fight between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor back in 2016 became one of the most successful pay-per-views in the history of the UFC, and ever since then, the two MMA stars have been poking shots at each other outside the ring even to this day. Just this past weekend, Conor McGregor learned about the promotional videos for UFC President Dana White's Power Slap League, and right off the bat, talked about how he wants to challenge his American MMA rival to a professional slap-off for the title. Conor McGregor talked about how the Power Slap League is an idea that he's growing to like more and more, asking questions about who gets to go first, whether there's a coin flip or not, how long do fighters have to recover, and how we'll know when a match is over. The Irishman called it madness while laughing, and then proceeded to say that he's in. Whether you hate him or love him, you have to admit this man is entertaining, and we'd love to see McGregor be a part of Dana White's Power Slap League, we're not gonna lie. The Irish UFC star called his longtime rival Nate Diaz out at the same time, poking fun at him by talking about how the American fighter would have a better chance of maybe winning at slapping than at MMA. Though Nate Diaz wasn't just going to sit back and let the Irish fighter say whatever he wanted to, let's see what his reply was. Up next we have Nate Diaz's reply to McGregor calling him out again. American MMA fighter Nate Diaz has been popular for his Stockton slap before he ever exchanged blows with McGregor. Got a lot more attention after he made the Irishman submit in their first UFC bout at UFC 196 back in 2016. And even though McGregor did end up getting revenge by beating Nate Diaz in their rematch at UFC 202, the American has made it a point to always remind the Irishman of how their first match went down. And that's exactly what Diaz used as a reply to McGregor calling him out and poking fun at him. When McGregor talked about how Diaz would have a better chance at winning in the Power Slap League, the American MMA star responded in kind by tweeting out a clip from their first fight, where you can see a weary and helpless McGregor as Nate Diaz slaps him around casually. The video is edited too, making the clip of the slap replay over and over again. The video is coupled with a caption talking about how Diaz has already beaten McGregor at that game, ending the caption with a slap emoji. But just 3 hours later, Diaz tweeted again, this time with another clip of the two going at it. This video was longer and showed Diaz punching around and dominating the Irishman, eventually getting on top of him and throwing punches. In the caption, Diaz said he'd knock him out faster than Floyd himself. That wasn't enough though. Diaz posted 2 more times on the same day. One was a close-up picture of him choking out McGregor, and the last one just said, "Boom roasted." Up next is McGregor and Diaz fighting for a third time and McGregor's broken leg. Even though the two fighters haven't been in the same ring for about 6 years now, talks about them getting a third match have never ceased. And why not? We think it'll be pretty interesting to see the two face off against each other and go at it again, and MMA fans worldwide know it. Though the two MMA fighters getting another fight has become a little more complicated now that Diaz isn't under UFC contract anymore. Yet Conor McGregor still teased fans at another fight against Nate Diaz while replying to his responses on Twitter. The UFC star from Ireland, however, is busy recovering from the severe leg break he went through at UFC 246 while going up against another American MMA fighter, Dustin Poirier. He'll need to wait a little before he can step foot into the ring again, no pun intended. Let's talk a little about Conor McGregor's fight against Dustin Poirier and his broken leg. Moving on, we have McGregor broke his leg while fighting Dustin Poirier. Back in July this year at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Conor McGregor went up against American UFC fighter Dustin Poirier and ended up with a broken leg. The doctors had to stop the fight early and end the match in the first round. It'd only been about 5 minutes of the Irishman and the American exchanging blows before both of them stepped back, and while landing, McGregor stumbled and trapped his foot under him, leading to his leg breaking. It was obvious McGregor couldn't keep fighting as medics were called to the octagon, and on orders by the doctor, Herb Dean, the referee had to call a stop to the fight. The Irish UFC star obviously wasn't happy at his misfortune. You could clearly see that while he gave his interview from inside the octagon with a cast wrapped around his broken leg. McGregor talked about how he was beating up his American opponent and how Poirier was only trying to close the distance by diving. McGregor added that this wasn't the end of the fight and that he'll take it outside if he had to. It's safe to say he won't be facing off against Dustin Poirier or Nate Diaz anytime soon, but sparks will fly whenever he clashes against either of the two American MMA fighters. McGregor had won his first match against Poirier at featherweight back in 2014, and Poirier got his revenge later in their second match, so there was a lot of hype surrounding their third match. It's unfortunate how it ended, more for Conor though. Maybe we'll get to see them fight again when he's back. Next we have Nate's last UFC fight and what's next for the American fighter. Back in September at the UFC 279 main event, Nate Diaz ended his UFC contract in style by making making Tony Ferguson submit in the 4th round with a guillotine choke. Diaz was initially going to fight Khamzat Chimaev, but ended up having to fight Tony instead at the last minute. He still went in guns ablaze though, as he displayed his relentlessness and toughness in a brutal battle between the two MMA stars. Diaz hit his opponent with a series of powerful blows, and when Tony tried to go for a takedown, Diaz put him in a guillotine, and that's how he won. After the fight, Nate Diaz announced his retirement from the UFC, a promotion he'd spent the last 15 years with, though he did say that he'd be back eventually after he dealt with some stuff outside the octagon first. The American fighter talked about how he's had a love-hate relationship with the YFC and thanks UFC president Dana White and others for giving him a platform to showcase his fighting abilities. Nate Diaz also talked about how he wants to put the UFC on pause for a bit and teach other UFC fighters how to go to another sport and take it over, saying Conor couldn't even do that. He aimed to try another sport and climb to the top of it, after which he added that he'll be back eventually to win the best title, a UFC title. There seemed to be some bad blood between him and the UFC, but the American isn't one to hold a grudge. So let's see what Nate Diaz plans outside the octagon. Up next, Nate Diaz in a boxing match against Jake Paul. The American UFC star turned free agent has some options he can pick and choose from for what he can do next, but it looks like he's already made up his mind. He wasn't kidding when he said he wanted to try out a different sport. Nate Diaz told Amit Shukla that he wants to fight Jake Paul in a boxing match. The YouTuber turned boxer already faced off against Anderson Silva from the UFC back in October and actually ended up beating him, shocking thousands. Diaz was excited to watch this fight with Silva as he talked about how Jake Paul is up to big things and that he considers the celebrity an option for himself too. Diaz said he's been fighting since he was 17 and that he was initially going to be a boxer, but he got stuck doing MMA because of contracts, but is glad that his UFC contract is finally over now. He also added that he hasn't stopped his boxing training since he started fighting, and we already know how talented this former UFC star is at fighting. We're sure he's going to put on a show for us. At 37 years of age, Nate Diaz is finally going to do what he's always wanted to, and we can't wait to see how it goes. We don't know when it'll happen though, so let's get back to him and McGregor. Lastly, we have McGregor's plan to fight Diaz. Earlier we talked about the two exchanging shots on Twitter and teasing a fight, and while doing so, McGregor laid out his game plan for the bout. The Irish UFC star did challenge Diaz to a slap-off in Dana White's league, but also told his strategy to fight Diaz in a proper match. McGregor talked about how he'd sprint from the moment the first bell rings and that he'd keep on sprinting for as long as he could and needed to. The Irish UFC star also talked about how he's been beating up people the same size and the same shape as the American mixed martial artist, and in a rare sighting, McGregor did give respect to Diaz before he went on a barely legible talk about how he'd beat up Nate Diaz. It may not be too likely for the two to meet in the octagon anytime soon, considering Nate Diaz is a free agent now, but he did say he'll be back, so all we can do is wait and see how this chapter unfolds. That's a wrap for this video. Who do you think would win the third McGregor versus Diaz fight? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.